I'm going to very inexpertly, I don't know if that's a word, but we'll use it, try to cover a little bit of what they were going to do to set this up. Only they knew what they were talking about, so I'll do my best. You know, when you look at gasoline, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on how an engine works, but a spark ignition engine, internal combustion engine, has a piston that comes up while you squirt air and gas in there, right? And it's supposed to explode in that combustion chamber when the spark from the spark plug goes off. It's not supposed to explode from the mere pressure and residual heat of the cylinder coming up and compressing that gas-air mixture, fuel-air mixture. And the way you do that is with octane. The more octane you have, the more pressure you can create in that cylinder without that pre-ignition. Why is that important? Well, that's what makes an engine efficient. That's why an E30 engine we talked about earlier today could be more efficient than today's engines, because you could really crank up the compression in those engines, downsize the engines, and have much greater fuel efficiency. So where did the petroleum industry go to get octane? And at the beginning, it was lead. Now, not like lead in a pencil, but it's a really long chemical name, tertiary something, 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 which I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to. And that's what they did. Well, in the 1970s, we decided that wasn't a really good idea because it kills you. So we wanted to phase out regular gasoline and move to unleaded gasoline. And as part of that, we actually ended up with a provision in the law of the Clean Air Act Amendments in 1990 that required an oxygenate in gasoline in the dirtiest parts. So California, East Coast, kind of from DC on up, some parts of Texas, Chicago, Milwaukee. They actually had to go a step further and put an oxygenate in their gasoline because that extra oxygen in the gas will allow it to burn cleaner. And so, of course, we have a wonderful oxygenate here in the Midwest called ethanol. But outside of the Chicago market, really, and maybe St. Louis, the oil industry decided to go from lead to MTBE. For those of you that followed the industry as long as I have, you know what MTBE is. It's another chemical that is, well, they never did decide whether it was a human carcinogen because it killed the rats and not the mice, or the mice and not the rats. So depending on whether you're a rat or a mouse, it might be deadly to you. But it did leak out of the tanks and at very, very low levels pollute the water and make the water unpotable. So I don't really care if it causes cancer. You weren't going to be able to smell and drink or shower or cook or clean with water. And so we went from lead to MTBE. So then people started suing about MTBE. The oil companies started to pull that out. Well, then they wanted to switch to aromatics. Aromatics are things like benzene, xylene, toluene. Benzene, I talked about earlier, it's a known human carcinogen. It does have octane, but it's not particularly healthy. And all this while, we've had biofuels. So that's kind of what got us here. So I'm supposed to talk about where we're at with fuel. So that's kind of the history of lead, the history of octane, and the role biofuels can play. Now, we have had some successes. Let's not undermine that. With the Clean Air Act and newer engine technologies, we do have much cleaner air today than 40 or 50 years ago. Some of you are old enough to remember, flying into LA and seeing this big brown dome of smog, or Phoenix in the winter and different things. That was carbon monoxide there. And you just don't actually see that anymore. And biofuels is a big part of that. Engine technology is a big part of that. Cleaner base fuels from petroleum, to be fair, is a part of that. So we just don't see that, although we do see that in other parts of the country where they don't have as sophisticated of refineries or regulations as we do. But one of the things that we're seeing is that even though we don't see that visible air pollution like we used to, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's bad, that is a very good thing. But even though we're not seeing that visible air pollution, air quality in the United States is still not what it should and could be. Most of the pollutants that we're dealing with today are largely invisible to the naked eye. It's particulate pollution, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and things like that. And what Angela Tin was going to go over was this growing body of evidence. And I'm not talking about from little, researchers paid for by weird people. I mean, we're talking about Harvard School of Medicine. I mean, I don't have the list. I apologize. I wasn't able to get her notes. But I've seen some of these studies. I don't understand them. I read the headline, and then they start using big words. But I've seen a lot of these studies, and what's very clear is, particularly with the aromatics in our gasoline, and these what are called ultra-fine particulate emissions that are so small. You know, when you went into a coal mine, you'd breathe in stuff and you'd cough it out. It was big, it was particulate emissions, you'd cough it out. These ultra-fine particulate emissions are so fine, are so small, when you breathe them in, you can't cough them out. They stay in. And they're doing enormous damage at literally a molecular, cellular, I don't know what the right science word is, but at that level, and literally changing how we are. And there's a growing body of evidence that this is really a next big health issue as we've increased aromatics in gasoline to replace some of these other octane components. That is a very dreadful overview of what two really intelligent ladies were going to share with you, but I did my best. I hope it sets up that, at least if you don't believe me, believe that other smart people know that we do have a health problem with our fuel today, and there are some solutions. There are some things that we can do to help that, and one of those things is biofuels. So now we shanghaied Gail Dennison, who is the Director of Development and Public Relations with the Hormel Institute, into moderating this panel to fill in for us, because she does work in this area, and that makes her way better for this than I would be. And she is going to introduce our guests and take it from here, and we're going to turn it over to Gail. So let's give Gail a round of applause.
Can you get this up here? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So we're already off to a little bit of a rough start because they did not tell me that I was going to be doing introductions. So I'm going to moderate by asking Dr. Stefan Mueller to introduce himself. He's an expert in the area of air quality and its role of emissions in air. We at the Hormel Institute, thanks to Rick Schwark, last saw Dr. Mueller in China, where we were at a conference, and Dr. Mueller spoke to about 300 cancer researchers on this subject. This is a conference that Dr. Zgangdong hosts in China. So please, Dr. Mueller, thank you.
Yeah. Do you want me to open?
I believe so because, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, thank you.
You'll do your slides.
So yeah, thank you. So we have to improvise a little bit since we have two people missing. I spent the last 2 hours being slightly paranoid myself that I'd be falling ill, you know, just because I sat around the same people. But so far, so good. All right. Let's see how that works. Yes, the next hurdle.
No,
So
you got it. It's
I got it?
actually on the screen over there.
Oh.
Yeah, oh, here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
But it doesn't show up here, right? No? Oh, now it does. Okay. All right, I'm getting there. So I originally I had these slides woven into some of my questions, but I'm going to give a little presentation now to set the stage a little bit for the discussion. Obviously, a lot of people have seen that slide. We've had a rapid ramp up, from 2005 to 2000. To the present in ethanol production. And then I've overlaid this slide, which is a fairly recent publication, and you can see dramatic decreases during the same time frame in key air toxins and pollutants, like 1,3-butadiene, very bad guy, benzene, right, that was just mentioned, very bad, as well as aldehydes, right? And then now, while there's all kinds of effects while these have come down, there is no doubt a contribution from increased use of ethanol in these decreases to be found. We have to understand, and that's very important, and we're sort of just promoting that now or realizing the importance of that even more, that not all air toxins are created equal, right? Butadiene and 1,3-butadiene and benzene are particularly bad. And you see this on these toxic weighing factors that are being used in California. Aldehydes, slight increases in aldehydes, which we sometimes see with ethanol combustion, have a very low toxicity rating. So what we're doing is we're weighing the mass of the toxins by its toxicity potency factor. And that can dramatically alter the outcome. So we were in Mexico in April last year, and we were given a presentation to the Mexican EPA. And the oil company, one of the major US oil companies, came in and had a slide, and they showed increases in aldehydes from ethanol production, but decreases in benzene and 1,3-butadiene. Well, we took that same exact slide, applied the weighing factors, and what ended up, it was a dramatic reduction in overall toxicity, right? A dramatic toxicity decrease, right? So what looked like some increase, some decrease, and a wash ended up making a very clear argument that when you apply the weighing factors, you have a dramatic decrease in air toxins from ethanol combustion. So at my university, with help from US Grains Council and Illinois Corn, we developed an emissions model called the IBEAM model. I titled it IBEAM for International Biofuels Emissions Analysis Model. And we looked at around 5 global cities. We looked at Mexico City, Seoul, Tokyo, New Delhi, and of course one I'm missing. New Delhi, Seoul, Tokyo, Mexico City. Yeah, anyways, we looked at 5 global cities and developed an emissions model, a spreadsheet-based emissions model. For that, we looked at the vehicle structure in those cities, vehicle retirement, projected vehicle retirement, announcement regarding EV vehicles, as Nilesh pointed out earlier. So we looked at how many new cars are needed, what's the retirement age, so what could conceivably be made up with EV vehicles. We looked at vehicle matrices. We looked at the current standards, current emission standards in these countries, and then we reviewed a lot of the literature studies, right, that look at combustion of ethanol. And what we found, we also incorporated the EPA complex model. And what we found, you can see here, basically the blue bar, the bar, most all emissions components, PM, hydrocarbons, and weighted air toxins. Remember we talked about weighted air toxins, all show decreases. With weighted air toxins showed significantly decreases. And that's no surprise, because we're not only diluting a benzene, we're also substituting it, right? We're substituting that aromatic with ethanol. So we have a dilution effect going on, and we have a substitution effect going on. And that drives dramatic air toxins reductions. So much so that on this graph, if you were to adopt, let's say, 6 or 7% of EV vehicles, down the road, and thereby cut out 6 or 7% or even 10% of tailpipe emissions within an airshed, ethanol would be a much better solution, right? And E10 would be a much better solution. Again, because with E10, you're not only cutting out 10%, you're not only diluting 10% down of benzene, you're also substituting it. So that's why you get much more bang for the buck. Versus an EV vehicle, you just cut out the tailpipe emissions. So that's a different way, I think, at looking at things here, and that's what what graph shows. And you can see that there's dramatic differences from E10 even going to E20, which makes a strong argument for higher ethanol blends. I think that slide was addressed. I also wanted to make sure, I didn't see there was a presentation on EV vehicles, but what is key is we have to really, when manufacturers make large announcements, we have to keep in mind, make large announcement on vehicle sales, right? Very aggressive new vehicle sales targets, 30%, 40%. We have to make sure that we understand that the vehicle stock changes much slower, right? And we just have to keep that in mind. That's why I personally do not see it in the immediate future a competition between ethanol and EV vehicles. Plus, again, you know, a lot of the abroad, talking now strictly abroad, in countries like Korea, India, etc., that use, you know, India loses 2% MTBE, and other countries have very low oxygenates. You know, there's obviously a huge potential to immediately blend ethanol into the existing fleet, and with that, reduce their emissions right away. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And one last part of that study that we did that I want to talk about it is we also looked at the refinery configuration in each of the countries that we studied, right? Because, you know, as we're trying to establish export markets and trying to make the argument for higher ethanol blends in other countries, we have to address what is the current refinery configuration. So we added up all the processing units that are installed in a country, and that varies, right? And when you blend ethanol, when refiners know that ethanol is going to be blended in, they can cut back on the tasking of the catalytic reforming unit. That's the unit that's responsible to produce the octane and the aromatics, right? If that's not needed because ethanol is coming in, they can, you know, operate those units at a lower volume and then bypass some additional gasoline blend stock around and are getting actually more volume out of the plant. The trade-off is that the aromatics produce usually a lot of hydrogen within a plant, and so they have to make up that hydrogen. So we did that trade-off, financial trade-off in all of those countries, right? You have to make up the hydrogen, which is a cost, but you get extra volume out. Now, you know, if you can sell that additional volume with growing fuel gasoline demands in these countries, these refineries can actually make more money. And that makes a pretty solid argument when you're over in these countries and you deal with regulators on that. So we've also done that. So then we did sort of the whole chain of production chain that we looked at for each of these countries. And so these are just some of the summary slides here. You know, again, I think ethanol, E10, E20 blends have a tremendous, you know, 25 blends in the US. I mean, for our study, I should mention, we looked at E10 and E20 blends, but for our country, for US, I should speak for E25, E30 blends, can certainly tremendously reduce emissions. You know, we even at very high annual sales, I think EV vehicles will not constitute an immediate cut into the market. Plus, they could actually complement each other, right? In many scenarios, we could get a lot more reductions by supporting both technologies, right? Or light EV vehicles, 48-volt systems integrated with ethanol, high ethanol engines. So there's all kinds of opportunities. So with that, yeah, I'll stop right here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mueller. Yes. So we will ask Dr. Mueller some specific questions in a little bit, and there will be a test for each of you of what you're understanding from our world-renowned scientific experts. Now, it's really impressive, and we're so thankful for their expertise at understanding at a very scientific level what you're all involved in with your industry. I'll next introduce the Executive Director of the Hormel Institute, Dr. Zigang Dong. He is considered a world expert in cancer prevention research. Now, over half of cancers can be prevented just through lifestyle alone, and clean air and reducing carcinogens in our environment are part of that. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Zigang Dong.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your very kind invitation. And I just received a notice midnight last night, said I should provide some slides. So here is the first slides. From these slides, you can see the incidence or the death rate in the United States. It's really, I have two arrows. The first one is indicated the lung cancer. The lung cancer deaths in the United States really going very, very fast until 1990s. And since then, there's a big turn and dropped very, very fast. Okay, so that is good news. And the other major cancer as well, also in the US, and we do a wonderful job. That's why the prevention, this is one of the very important evidence indicated the prevention really works. And part of that is because of we have a clean air, better food, and better treatment, as well as the other things in the US, we are doing the right thing. But however, in the worldwide, that's not that situation. Worldwide, cancer will really increase very, very dramatic. And this slide is from WHO, is World Health Organization. And they project that globally, the cancer incidence deaths will increase around 45% to the 2030s. And that is huge. That will really increase, many, many millions, over 10 millions in the 2030s. And most of these cancer actually, you can compare in the United States and the European countries, in Japan, the most developed countries, the cancer incidence is going down. However, the cancer incidence in the developing countries, especially China, India, and other part of the world, they really will increase very, very dramatically. This is one slide actually in the airplane I picked up. This is actually, we lose the war against the cancer. This is in Chinese, okay? So the reason, the Chinese magazine indicated that is simply because if you go to Beijing, you can experience that. There is a very heavy pollution and you cannot breathe, okay? That's really have a lot of consequence on the health. And one of that is lung cancer. So it's a lot of chemicals in the air pollution, many of them actually from the car, from the gasoline that is actually go to the air and cause air pollution, and that eventually, damage the health. But of course, I want to, emphasize that smoking is another major resources for the, small environmental, the air pollution. The person created it for him or herself, but that is a small environmental that is also very important for cause the lung cancer. So, actually, I will just indicate that this is why the prevention is so important. From the previous presenter, the slides you can see, if you use ethanol to prove the air quality, that can really reduce the carcinogen from the gasoline to the environment is very, very important. I think one of the reasons why in this country the lung cancer incidence going down is partially is because of the Clean Air Act. Mm-hmm. And partially because we have a much, much clean air in this country. And partially because we have a very, very successful smoker cessation program as well. So both of that is important. And therefore, your job is very important, okay? And last year, when we have the meeting in China about the cancer conference in last September, by coincidentally, they just announced that the Chinese government also required 10% of ethanol should added to their gasoline as well. That will, of course, I think will be tremendously reduce their air pollution in the future, and hopefully that will also create a huge market for you guys here. Okay.
That's right.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Dong. Yes. See, Mr. Rick Schwartz's power, while we were having our cancer conference in China, that very week, China announced the ethanol thing. So we had good luck with that, and Dr. Mueller was there. Okay, next we are very thankful that our representative from the American Lung Association is here. So we would like to hear from Angela Tin, and then we'll get to the questions. Thank you, Angela.
Is the microphone on? Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. Where's the advancer? Remote?
Did you leave the mic?
Oh, this, I didn't realize. You, yeah, this.
Green arrow?
Yeah.
Are we queued up?
Yep. It's already there.
Okay, so here's a picture. This is why we're here, is because the mobile transportation sources, whether you live in a town of 100,000 or you live in a metro city of 6 million, the mobile sources in the airshed are 40 to 70%. So it doesn't matter. People always call us, what's a good place to live? Well, there aren't a lot of good places to live because we all drive. Now, doctors said that the cancer rates are going down due from smoking, and that is true. And I work at the American Lung Association, and when I started working there 13 years ago, the average smoking rate was 20%, and we're now at about 16% of the average people are smokers, which is good. However, of these 16% that are smoking, 2/3 of these people are from never smokers. So the cancer rate is going down, but there is cancer from non-smokers. And that's a brand new fact that we just found out recently. So if these people are getting cancer and they're never smokers, where does the cancer come from? So if you look at the health effects of ozone, there are a lot of health effects that come from ozone. A lot of the ozone we're concerned with is ground level ozone, not the higher level ozone, but the lower level ozone. And it affects every aspect of the body. It affects the lungs, it affects the hearts, it affects the brain, and it also affects child development. Particulate matter. The body is a very miraculous organism, and we can expel most things that we take into our body through our nose and through our mouth. Most naturally occurring particulate matter we can remove. But what happens is that man-made particulate matter as a result of combustion of fuel sources, combustion at the power plants are very small, and they get embedded deep in the lungs. And we call this PM10, 10 microns, or PM 2.5. And what happens is that it goes deep into the lungs, the body cannot expel it, and this causes, on a cellular level, lung cancer. The risks of particulate matter are similar to the risks from ozone. It gets deep into the alveoli, and you get shortness of breath, you get lots of problems associated with respiratory disease. Now, there's also a toxic component of gasoline, and we talk about the criteria pollutants and the conventional pollutants, but there's also the toxics, which includes benzene, and benzene is one of the few carcinogens that's classified as a Group A carcinogen. Now, US EPA doesn't willy-nilly call things carcinogens. You have to pass a very strict test. And it has to have data, factual data that links the chemical to humans. And so there's benzene, xylene, toluene, 200,000 other chemicals in gasoline. And every batch of gasoline is different. When I worked at the EPA and we had oil spills, to go and sample that oil, you had to know what was in there. And it was very hard to classify the oil because the raw materials were different every time. But these toxics are the ones that causes the lung cancer. You're concerned about particulates, great. You're concerned about ozone, but these toxic components are probably the number one concern. There's other environmental effects, not just to humans, but to our buildings. It causes problems to the cement in our buildings. It causes problems to the tires. I was watching this article this morning, and they were talking about what's the difference between building structures built by the Romans and building structures made of cement, concrete, built by people today. And what they found out was that most buildings that are built today last probably probably 50 years, before a building starts to fall apart. But the cement the Romans use will last, and as it ages, it becomes harder and harder. Well, the Romans weren't, susceptible to the pollution, and so we really got to wonder, is the Roman buildings as strong today as they thought they were? Okay, lead. Okay, we had leaded gas. I had it in my lifetime, and I even have that little sign that says this fuel contains lead. And that's one example of how the nation got together, and there was a lot of problems with lead in children, in children's blood. And this was after, we got rid of all the lead in buildings and in paint and building materials and bridges, but they were still suffering with lead. And lead is a neurotoxin. And this graph shows a direct correlation between the total banning of lead and the blood lead levels. So which just goes to show that if you still continue to clean up the components of fuel, you will have a marked improvement in air quality and lung health. MTBE, when the United States had to make a decision as to whether they're going to use ethanol or MTBE as an oxygenate, everybody in California started to use MTBE. And MTBE has no practical purpose, and it is a man-made material. And what they found out was that it was, when the MTBE was released from gasoline sites when they had a spill, the MTBE was it had a very disagreeable odor. Now, you may complain that you have chemical causes this concern or this concern, but when you have an odor in your groundwater, nobody will tolerate that. And so as a total act, MTBE was banned in every single state in the United States. So I guess this last slide shows that there are improvements in air quality because of their improvements in fuel usage, and lead was one of them. Reformulated gas, there was a lot of improvements in reformulated gas because we started using ethanol. We reduced the toxics by 40%, the benzene by 40%, and then most of the fuel is now E10. 98% of the fuel is E10, and then MTBE is a total ban. So is there a way to improve air quality? Yes, there is. And the way is to improve the fuel that we use today. And we all use fuel because we all drive 1 to 4 cars apiece. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yes, excellent. Okay, and now we'll ask each of our presenters a few questions, and hopefully at the end, if any of you have questions, there will be a short time for that. So Dr. Mueller, we'll first ask you the question, why is ethanol an appealing solution now?
So I would say, over the last 10 years, originally there was a lot of confusion with the right land use models, right? Those land use predictions from ethanol were overblown, and I think we were able to correct the science on that. We still need to watch land expansion, develop satellite tools where we can track land, but the science on this area, I think, is iterating towards, originally it was overblown. We had overblown models that predicted way too much land use in response to our production capabilities. And the models also way underestimated the efficiency of the American farmer and the new technologies that would come in. Secondly, at this point in life, we've also really updated our emissions model, our tailpipe emissions model, are in the process too. There are several groups here, urban air improvement resources, et cetera, that work with EPA to try to improve the MOVES model, right? That's used in emissions modeling. Very important, right, that we get these models right. So at this point in life, I think we are at a stage where the science is that we have really the upper hand on science, right, that we have peer-reviewed publications. Plus, on an international level, CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions is really being watched as a metric, right, in response to the COP climate proceedings. And corn ethanol, because we have kept our models updated, is in a great position to access these foreign markets based on sound science that we've developed and the peer-reviewed publications that we've written. Case in point, I've been sending a lot of this background materials to Japan, as they're considering opening their fuel market, and thank God we had developed all these scientific documents. The same for Europe, Colombia, Brazil,
Very good.
et cetera. So I think the time is there where we have access to good science and we can prove our point.
Very good. Okay, so the next question is to Dr. Dong. Dr. Dong, even if cancer death rates have gone on in 22 states in the United States, it's still the leading killer of Americans over heart disease. Why is prevention of cancer so important?
Oh, I think that's too simple, because this cancer is such a deadly disease. Once people get a cancer, are really afraid of it, because it's like a death sentence. Even though we have a lot of improvement in the last 10 years about the cancer treatment and therapy. We have targeted therapy, precision oncology, everything. However, we still do not have a very good method to cure cancer. People once get a cancer, many cancer, especially lung cancer, the 5-year survival rate is still low. And therefore, the best way is don't get it. And this is so obviously, if you don't get the cancer, you can avoid the cancer. That is such a wonderful thing. And to do that, don't introduce the carcinogen to our environment. And you guys' work is actually, you didn't realize that the ethanol can really prevent that. So.
Very good. So the next question, Angela. So of the major or criteria air pollutants measured by EPA, lead is the only one that has been reduced from coming out of the tailpipe. In addition, MTBE, which was used in some parts of the country, is now banned. Can you walk us through how we got the lead and MTBE out of gasoline and what we're using instead?
There were health effects, direct health effects that they saw. Lead is a neurotoxin. It was in the blood of people. It was in the blood of children. MTBE smelled to high heavens. You didn't want to drink it. And it's just a small drop of MTBE in groundwater that has a disagreeable odor. So when it impacted people at their homes, in their kitchens, in their houses, by God, it made a difference. And people started speaking up and said, we got to do something. We've never seen a total ban of lead and MTBE as quick as we saw EPA do. I worked for EPA, and things like that don't happen. They talk, and the scientists come and say, well, it's not really MTBE, it's not really a carcinogen, it's just your well water. They talk, but because it impacted on people and there were direct results, it happened. And it can happen in America with ethanol.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Mueller, how achievable is it to widely deploy a higher ethanol blend in the near term?
Yeah, so I think we're working hard on it right now. So there's a group called the Ag Auto Ethanol Alliance that's solely focused on high-octane fuels. Right? I think we all realize the tremendous benefits from high-octane fuels. So what we're putting together are the fuel specs that would come with the high-octane fuels, trying to solve some of the infrastructure problems, get a certification fuel in place. I think this is a good thing, but we have to be going forward. I feel like we have to be, and it's more a personal comment, we have to be quite aggressive about it, right? So I think in this administration, there might be, in my opinion, a door opening to, that allows us to be a little bit more aggressive and try to push it forward now. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, we have the data packages, we have the science established, we have some of the engine testing done. We need more engine testing, that is true. We need more engine testing on high octane fuels, E25, E30, engines with high compression ratios that can take advantage of the high octane, right? We need more on that. We always need more on that. But again, the ag, auto, ethanol group is, I think, in my opinion, is making great inroads on that, and it's time to sort of keep the pressure up now and use that opportunity. Secondly, I feel like with export markets, right, as we're educating other countries, like, for example, like Japan, right, we sent a lot of data packages over there. They really got into the life cycle modeling of corn ethanol, and with that, they're coming up to speed, right? They're sort of establishing their own research centers over there that study, different biofuels, and that can act as an accelerant for us as well, right? Because now you're not just having groups here and there, and different US universities and maybe somewhere in Europe. Now you have them over in Asia, right? That's focused solely on studying US corn ethanol plants, the life cycle analysis, the engine performance, et cetera. I think that could be very complementary and also accelerate deployment.
Very good. Dr. Dong, at the genetic level, something that we can understand, what role does reducing or removing a carcinogen play in health?
That's a very good question. So the reason I said that, when I first time came to United States, my PhD work is focused on that.
Yes.
I try to find a carcinogen, the benzoyl from the diesel extract, and how that binding with the DNA, and after binding with DNA, how it causes the DNA mutation, and oncogene mutation, tumor suppressor gene mutation. It's a really very complicated process. But if you ask me how that works, it's simply because our body, the cells, it's almost like a car. You have the gas panel, you have a brake as well. And it's very well controlled. If you want the car move forward, you just touch the gas panel. If you want the car stop, you hit the brake. However, when the carcinogen binding with the DNA and mutated the oncogene, that is almost like our gas panel. We just the final result is the car cannot stop. The brake is broken, and the car can go ahead all the time. It's a result of the cell divided all the time, and eventually to form a big mass that is cancer.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah. Okay, Angela, who is most at risk with the carcinogens and with the pollutants?
Cancer occurs, and there's three things you have to have. You have to have exposure, you have to have the concentration, and you have to have genetics, okay? So you take those three factors, and then you develop cancer. I can't tell you who's at risk. Generally, all of our protection for carcinogens or chemicals is towards the elderly and towards the young people. They're the ones that are at risk because their systems are growing or their systems are older and they don't have the defenses as they used to. However, with gasoline and with cars and with mobile transportation, we're all at risk, even healthy people, because in air pollution, if you can't breathe, nothing else matters.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Dr. Mueller, looking out 20, 30 years, many countries and states are investing heavily in electric vehicles to address both air quality and climate change. Given these trends, do you see ethanol playing an important role in the future?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that on my slides. I think we need both electric vehicles and high octane ethanol engines, right? And maybe both together in one car, right? With low voltage systems. However, I just want to caution, as with any new technologies, and EV is a new technology. It's a new propulsion method. there will be unintended consequences, right? We've seen it, for lack of a better example, but in the whole biofuel space, the whole ILUC debate could be considered an unintended consequence. Now, again, it was overblown, but for a while it derailed, or it threatened to derail, or it threatened how we look certainly at the benefits of ethanol quite a bit. Now I think that's coming down now, and we've resolved that. But EV vehicles, right? Everybody is enthusiastic about it, but they will face a similar set of unintended consequences. It's always been the same. They will come back, right? Whether it's fragile distribution architecture that we hear from certain tests in Europe, that cannot keep up once you plug 2 or 3 cars into a distribution apartment building. So it's going to come, and there's going to be a big debate on whether we were too enthusiastic about EV vehicles. That's my prediction. That said, I think we need both technologies there. They're complementary. E10 and E15 worldwide can be put into the existing vehicle fleet by and large right now and reduce emissions by and large right now. And then EV vehicles can go through the adoption curve, to 20, 30, 40% and further reduce emissions.
Very good. Okay, Dr. Dong, as a cancer research professor, do you see ethanol as a valuable tool in addressing public health? And how do you feel about, you study cancer and yet an industry is reducing toxins and aiming to improve air quality? So how do you feel about the ethanol industry, and is it a valuable tool in addressing public health?
Yes, indeed. I think I almost answered the question in the previous answer already. Yes. But I will emphasize on that. In the cancer research, we know the causing agent, the carcinogen, is very important. If we find a way to eliminate it in the very beginning, of course, that's the best way for prevention. The ethanol, I view that is one of the very important tools for the public health.
And do you think the people in Beijing are going to like blue sky more than one day a year?
Well, we all human beings. We all deserve to have a blue sky, clean air.
That's right. So, excellent. Angela, what's really toxic in our fuels?
What's toxic in our fuels is man-made material. We've known that man-made drugs and man-made chemicals are the problem. They're purified and they're produced to serve a purpose. They're not holistic, they're not renewable, they're not an alternative. And so because it's a man-made chemical, it's not good for you. 43% of that fuel, that's quite a lot of benzene. We don't have any use for benzene except in the petrochemical industry. Why would we put it in our cars, and why would we breathe it?
Okay. Now we have just a few minutes left, and so we will open it up to the audience for any questions you might have for our panelists.
Yes, my name is Brad Brunner from Glacial Lakes Energy, and we've been working on a fair amount of efforts splash blending E10 to E30. And Dr. Mueller, I have a question for you. Back to your slide that showed the difference that chemicals that could be made or more profitably in the refining industry. And I'm curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because obviously we don't want the quality of our fuel to be decreased. You talked about substitution as well as displacement and so forth, and increasing the quality. So obviously for the auto industry, what they're concerned about with E15 is the loss of octane. We want to protect the octane. So how do you do that in a refinery to generate additional, so we have a win-win? They generate an additional level of profitability and we end up with cleaner air to boot. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm correct me if I understand your question wrong, but and I'm not providing the right answer, but basically what we looked again at the refinery situation in each country, right? And obviously, how would refiners react if they were told that they had to add E10 our E20 to the baseline gasoline, right? So currently, obviously, they're producing octane in the catalytic reformer units and aromatics by that. And knowing, right, that to the baseline gasoline, they're going to be adding ethanol, which is an octane enhancer, they can reduce then the output from that catalytic reforming unit in the refinery. And what that allows them is to route more gasoline volume around that unit and basically get a higher output of gasoline blend stock, right? That is now obviously lower in aromatics, right? And but they know that ethanol is going to come in. So now what we did is that trade-off between more volume, which could mean more revenue for a refinery, against the fact that the catalytic reformer also produces hydrogen for use elsewhere in the plant. And so now, if you run your severity of your catalytic reformer unit at much lower levels, you have to make up that hydrogen deficit. Because again, that hydrogen is used somewhere else in the plant, and so you have to add additional hydrogen production facilities. So we did this trade-off in financial return and financial outlay for building the additional hydrogen plant, but getting the revenue from the additional volume, and in many, many areas, that returned more money to the refiners in those countries.
Thank you. Steve Vandergreen, Urban Air Initiative, and know quite a bit about this because that's where I do most of my research. The United States has a really good opportunity here to promote E10 today, reducing aromatic benzenes 7-8 billion gallons a year in the US. So we have a great story to tell to these other countries, China, where they run higher benzene aromatics in their fuel. My concern, though, is a lot of these countries still look to the US, look to the EPA, look to CARB, ARB, and the EPA, thanks to the American petroleum industry, models ethanol to be worse. E15 is worse than E10 in ozone, NOx, PM, because the science has been manipulated by the American petroleum industry. So we need to have a strong ethanol-led coalition team to go in there and dispel the science that has been manipulated by how you blend test fuels. And then we have a great story here in the US and in China, how ethanol can reduce the toxics and provide higher efficiency. But until we take on the science, we've had the EPA for several years now say the RFS2 is going to raise mortality rates by 245 lives.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of academics on the East Coast, West Coast that don't have this appreciation you do for ethanol. So we have to do something together as an industry to approach that.
Right. But Steve, so I think I agree with all of your points. They're very excellent points. But you should also mention that we have started to work on it, right, in various different groups, right? You're very active in promoting additional engine emissions work and analyzing that, right? And you got additional papers coming out. And you're involved in trying to work with EPA and correcting the MOVES model. That's very needed, right? And so other groups are doing the same thing. So it's not that we are just complaining and saying, oh, yeah, you know, that needs to be done. I think we are now doing it, right? We're really actively engaging.
Right, but we have to do it as an industry, not just as collective or different groups. We have to come together as an industry to tackle this problem because we have a much bigger opposition called the API, the American Petroleum Institute, that has generated more data against ethanol than we've generated data for ethanol. So it's got to be a collective group.
Right.
Thank you. Well, I believe that's all the time that we have for our panel. Again, I want to thank Iowa Renewable Fuels for their support of Pink at the Pump and Rick Schwark of Absolute Energy, and all of you for inviting us here to talk about health and ethanol. So thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you.